IMF, and chaired by Francisco Guillén Martín from INEGI. He's the deputy chair in national accounts here in Mexico. So it's very important for us, this panel, and thank you once again. Francisco, could you please?
Yes, of course. Well, thank you very much. Welcome to everybody.
He has been starting to look into to the issue of infrastructure. As I mentioned, currently in the macroeconomic statistical manuals, there is no one definition for infrastructure. So it's important to come up with a definition. So I will focus on general definitions that are used in the outside world, and also show what some specific countries are doing in the field of infrastructure, how they define it. And then I will show the proposed definition and classification that we came up with from the OCDE side for a definition of infrastructure to be used in macroeconomic statistics. We also conducted a short questionnaire just to see what countries have available according to this definition and the classification. So I will show some results from that questionnaire in terms of country practices, and then I will conclude the presentations with some main takeaways. So to start with the introduction, so why has the OCDE been starting to look into the issue of infrastructure? So we currently have a horizontal project, which means that a lot of directorates within the OECD are involved on a project to focus on strategic policies for sustainable infrastructure, with the main aim to ensure that infrastructure meets its economic, environmental, social, and development objectives. So in this sense, infrastructure is a very important policy instrument affecting economic policies, environmental policies, social developments. So it's very important to have good information on that, and to see what we can derive from all the relevant information. And another issue why we started to look into this topic is to address some emerging challenges and issues in the field of planning and the investment in and the financing of infrastructure investments. So we see that infrastructure investments are normally quite complex, involving quite a lot of players, various stakeholders indeed, that need to collaborate. So it's important also to have better information to address some of these challenges. So it's clear from this project that there is a strong measurement agenda, focusing on what has been done by companies and the government at the micro level, but also to obtain better information at the meso and the macro level. However, to be able to come up with recommendations and to compare trends in countries, there is a need for a common understanding and a definition of infrastructure. So one of the main goals also of this horizontal project is to come up with clear definitions. So that moves us into the issue of defining infrastructure. So as you look at the current statistical standards, there is not a specific definition of infrastructure. So it is being referred to in certain standards, like the product classifications and the system of national accounts, the balance of payments. They might refer to specific assets that might be included or that might be considered infrastructure, but there is no one definition. So what we did was to start with looking at some existing definitions, for example, Wikipedia. So if you look at Wikipedia, they define infrastructure as the set of fundamental facilities and systems that support the sustainable functionality of households and firms, and that includes the services and facilities necessary for its economy to function. So it mainly focuses on tangible assets, facilities and systems, focusing on what is needed to have the economy to function. So they refer to public and private physical structures, such as roads, railways, bridges, tunnels, water supply, sewers, electrical grids, and telecommunications. So they provide some specific examples of what should be included. Looking at what we have been doing within the OECD, we as part of the horizontal project, developed a handbook for the quality infrastructure investment. And here we came up with a definition explaining that infrastructure provides connectivity by enabling the flows of goods, people, and information, and supplying the necessary inputs in the form of energy and water that constitute the foundation for human well-being and most economic activity. Systems that are supporting some basic functions in the economy. How to delineate? Do you only take into account the economic part of the infrastructure that is benefiting the economy directly, or do you also look at the more social aspects of infrastructure, so linking it to education services, healthcare services, recreation, culture? So there are quite a lot of differences in what is currently being done across countries. So this is why we try to have a look and try to combine the best of all the available definitions and ongoing work. So we came up with a definition that could be used in macroeconomic statistics. So looking at all this available information, we came up with the following. So defining infrastructure as the set of fundamental facilities and systems that support the provision of goods and services essential to enable, sustain, or enhance societal living conditions and protect the surrounding environment from erosion and other disasters that reduce the usefulness for economic purposes. So looking at what is relevant for the economy as well as for societal living conditions. And we also explained that it is composed of public and private physical structures. So not only looking at what is being provided by government, but also by private entities. And it also includes intellectual property products supporting the effective operation of these structures. So also acknowledging R&D software that is related to these physical structures that are needed to have the society functioning well. We also noticed that it's important to make a distinction between economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. So looking at specific functions as provided by the economic infrastructure, this concerns transport, utilities, so provision of energy, water, sanitation, waste management. And it also includes flood protection, water management, and IT and communications. So that's all embedded within economic infrastructure. And then looking at the functions as provided by social infrastructure, this concerns education, healthcare, public order and safety, culture and recreation. And if countries are compiling results, it's important to make this split to be transparent on what is included in the infrastructure measure, and then making further breakdowns if that is available from the measurement side. So in that sense, we also came up with a classification. So looking at economic infrastructure, this could be broken down into transport-related infrastructure, utilities-related infrastructure, flood protection and water management-related infrastructure, and IT and communications-related stuff. With further breakdowns, if available and if significant in a country, and if there is user demand for each of these categories. So for example, transport could be further broken down into land transport, water transport, air transport, and space transportation elements. The same for the utilities, the same for the flood protection. So dependent indeed on what is relevant in a country. And if countries are indeed applying this, it might lead to comparable results with other countries. On the social infrastructure side, so here it is broken down into education-related infrastructure, health-related infrastructure, public order and safety, culture and recreation, and again, some further breakdowns for each category. So for example, if you look at culture, you might want to break it down into museums, historical sites, religious centers and memorial sites, and the same goes for the other categories. And again, dependent on what is available in countries. So when we developed these proposals that we think are very useful for countries to focus on and to come up with comparable results across countries, we were quite interested to see if countries were already complying with some of these or would have already information available in line with some of these breakdowns. So we sent out a short questionnaire in 2021 on the available breakdowns of investments in capital stock, focusing on the category other buildings and structures. So this is a specific category that is collected as part of the system of national accounts data collection. So most countries would have available data for this category, and then to figure out if they would have more granular information that would fit the definition of infrastructure and the categories. So 35 countries responded to this, and only 2 of these 35 did not have any subcategories available. So most of the countries did have some level of detail. So looking at the detail, all countries would have breakdowns available into buildings other than dwellings, and then other structures and land improvements, further broken down into the 2. And this is already a necessary step if you want to go to the functional breakdown of infrastructure. And when we ask some follow-up questions, some countries indeed have additional breakdowns available related to infrastructure, either by asset type, so they have more granular information, for example, on the category other structures, and then this might help you to link it to the functional categories that I showed in the earlier slides, or they have functional breakdowns available, already linking some of these assets to specific functions. But often they are not published. They are only available for internal use, but we hope with the proposal that more and more countries are moving in this direction to start publishing this very relevant information. So at the time, 2021, we had a look which countries were already publishing results on some of these specific classes. So when you look at the classes that I showed before, when you look at the breakdown on the economic infrastructure, 4 countries are already breaking down and publishing results on transport. 2 are providing results on utilities related infrastructure, only 1 on the flood protection and water management, and 2 on the IT and communications. And then when you look at, for example, land transport, 14 countries are publishing. So that is pretty well covered in that sense. But for most of the categories, it was rather limited at the time of the questionnaire. And hopefully this has already been increasing, and hopefully this will further increase in the coming years when people and countries are trying to comply with some of these breakdowns. So this is on the economic infrastructure side. On the social infrastructure side, the picture is even more limited. So here we have breakdowns, education, 3 countries, health-related infrastructure, 4 countries, and then for the other categories, it's a bit more limited. So again, the hope is that more countries are moving in this direction. So some main conclusions from this work. We see that there is an increasing demand for data on infrastructure, and we are being approached by more and more countries to explain what might be done. And we are very happy indeed to see the interest also in Mexico at INEGI to further invest in this very important work. But what we also see is that not a lot of countries are currently compiling results on infrastructure. So there is quite a bit of work to do here. And we hope that the proposed definitions and classification for infrastructure will help these countries to arrive at comparable measures across countries. In this sense, the classification would imply linking specific types of assets to the functional infrastructure categories. So a lot of the information needed to come up with the relevant information might already be available, because you have to develop estimates on the various types of assets for coming up with the aggregated results for the national accounts in any case. And now it would be looking at more granular levels and to link them to the functional categories. So in this sense, countries that face strong user demand for infrastructure data, as is, for example, the case in Mexico, they are encouraged to use this definition and classification to compile the relevant results. So this is what I wanted to share with you. If there are any questions, we can have a discussion later on indeed. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks. Back to you, Francisco. or Paco.
Okay, thank you, Jorrit. Well, you said a lot of things. Of course, was a very impressive and clear presentation in relation with the proposed definition from one side, the classification for other side, and the real view about what happened with some social infrastructure, probably natural goods and natural environment in relation with infrastructure. And this is one of the most important things. And of course, the experience, the practical that you give us about the countries that answer the question, give us an idea about what happened in this field. Thank you very much. And we will back to some specific questions and discussion after the presentation of Jim. Jim, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Just maybe you can confirm if you can see my presentation okay? Everything looking good on your side?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I think it's a really important topic. I'd like to congratulate both the OECD and Mexico for the work that's being done in this area and for the ambitions of standing up some of these statistics. So I'm going to kind of pick up my presentation a little bit from where you're left off, and in many ways talk a little bit about a bit of a deeper dive into the type of information users are looking for with respect to infrastructure statistics program. And so Jorrit did a great job, what I would say, covering the conceptual framework and the state of play. But I'm going to do a little bit of a discussion around some of the additional things that you might want to think about including in an infrastructure statistics program. Talk a little bit about the source data and the growing set of source data that I think is available to compile these type of statistics. And then just one slide at the end on stressing the importance of presenting this information in an analytically useful way to users. So as Jorrit mentioned, I mean, the key design of any infrastructure program is the conceptual framework that he laid out. So the definitions, if you would, of infrastructure, the classifications, and in terms of, what are we attempting to measure, and I think that's extremely important. And what often comes out of that are things like the stock and the flow of the infrastructure assets. But what, at least in our experience, what users have also been asking for is, well, it's not just quantifying the value of your infrastructure, but we need a little bit more granular information about, well, who's using this infrastructure? What's the condition of the infrastructure? Who has access to this infrastructure? And then also information on thematics. And these are things that are top of mind, say, within a government's policy framework, whether that be things like climate, digitalization, and inclusion. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through just a few ideas around each of these, and maybe just to stimulate a little bit of a conversation in the panel discussion. So on use. As I mentioned, many governments, many private sector firms are interested in how is the infrastructure being used, and take something like public transit. How many riders are using public transit? We made a big investment in public transit. Are we getting the ridership that we need? And specifically, who and what are the groups that are using public transit, and as an example. So I think when we think about infrastructure statistics, we have to think about, well, not just quantifying the infrastructure itself, but also who is using it. Also top of mind is questions about the condition of the infrastructure. So not only do I want to know how many bridges we may have in a country, but I want to know how safe it is as I cross over that bridge. We want to know how modern certain infrastructure is. We want to know when we may need to make additional investments in this infrastructure based on the condition. And of course, within the National Accounts Framework and National Accounting Framework, we talk about things like service lives, and we talk about things like rates of depreciation, consumption of that fixed asset. But more and more, users are asking for a little bit more granular information on the condition. Now, this is very difficult to get at, and sometimes we can only get kind of subjective assessments. And I know when I was in Canada, we were working on a public infrastructure survey, and we had to turn to subjective type of assessments where we were really asking individuals and planners whether they thought the infrastructure was very good, poor, or in need of major investments. And I have to admit, there are always some challenges around that, because what you may consider to be very good, someone else may consider to be excellent, or someone else may consider poor. But that is one way to get at these types of condition measurements. The next design element that I think is often type of information that's often requested by users is access. So infrastructure is very much a geographic type of asset. It's located somewhere. And the question is what type of access do people have to that infrastructure? So here I threw a map of the skating rinks, the ice hockey rinks in Canada, and similar thing might be football fields in Mexico. And as a kind of a recreational piece of infrastructure, there's lots of discussion about, well, how many young people have access to these types of infrastructure? Which groups within a country can access this infrastructure? And some of the user demands are very, very detailed to say, well, in terms of gender, which genders have access to these types of infrastructure moving forward? And again, this is critically important for governments to understand where they may need to stand up certain types of infrastructure. And I would say that this is particularly important into the social field that Jorrit was mentioning, where governments are really interested in how things like culture and recreation are spread, if you would, across a country. So you have these design elements of looking at infrastructure, the use of infrastructure, the condition of infrastructure, the access to infrastructure. And there's many, many more design elements, I think, need to be thought of when designing a infrastructure program. And it really needs to be done in consultation with users to see, well, what are their most important needs? At the same time, there's another there's policy drivers that you need to think about when you're designing an infrastructure statistics program. And I'll just take you through a few of examples. So one would be something like climate change in infrastructure. And we know that many countries are transitioning towards a low carbon energy posture. And there's going to be a need to invest in certain types of infrastructure, whether that's related to wind generation, solar generation, water, geothermal, charging stations. So how many charging stations? What's the infrastructure with respect to electric vehicles that a country is putting in place, and does it meet the needs of maybe where the country wants to go in terms of its use of electric vehicles? So it's critically important that as we move into a bit of a new energy system, that we have a good handle on the infrastructure to support that transition to a low carbon energy posture. And not only do we want to know about the installations, if you would, but we also want to know about the capacity and the capacity utilization. And that's another important set of statistics I think we need to think about in terms of an infrastructure program. And that gets a little bit back to the use that we talked about before. But I know that in a number of countries, these are critically important. Another area where I think, again, on the climate side, which will be very important, is understanding that we are facing increasing risk of climate hazards. I mean, we just had a massive hurricane in the United States whip through Florida. This has large implications on infrastructure and on the destruction of infrastructure. And we need to have and develop things like forward-looking physical risk indicators with a focus on critical infrastructure implications. And I think that's a growing need as you think about an infrastructure program. And I know we, along with the OECD and other international agencies and the G20 countries such as Mexico, are putting together a data gaps initiative that is going to try and get at some of these physical and transition risk indicators. And I think as we design that set of statistics, it will be important to think about infrastructure in the design of that type of program. Another area where there's large demand is in the area of inclusion and infrastructure. Infrastructure can be a vehicle to foster inclusion, but it can also exacerbate inequalities. And my experience is all users, when they're looking at the use of infrastructure, they really want detailed information about, well, which specific household groups are using this infrastructure. Is this investment that we made fostering inclusion? Can we look at use by things like gender or household composition? And that will go a long way in understanding the impact of the investment and also where maybe future investments may be required. So I would say that if you're designing a program, you really have to think about the inclusion aspect of that program. And then maybe the last kind of theme I'll touch upon is just digitalization. And I would say, it could be argued that, the communication network or high-speed communication network is maybe one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure in a country. We certainly saw that during COVID, where we all relied to do much of our work. We all relied on a high-speed communication network to do much of our work. I mean, just this dialogue here is requiring on a digital infrastructure in order for us to communicate and share ideas and exchange ideas. And just to illustrate how increasingly important this is becoming, recently in my home country in Canada, there was about a 1 or 1.5 day outage of a major provider. Rogers Communication provides communication services to many Canadians, and just through an update of their servers and their network, the whole thing went down for about a day. And the implications that caused on business, on even the healthcare system, the 911 calls weren't necessarily working. People couldn't use their debit cards and their credit cards to pay for things. It was absolutely incredible. And it just reinforced this idea of how so much of our social and economic lives depend on communication networks. and not only depend on communication networks, but depend on them operating at a very, very high capacity with redundancies built in. So I think, again, as you're thinking of an infrastructure statistics program, this whole idea of digitalization and digital networks and communication networks, I think, is a key and important focus. And the last one is maybe an idea that's out there a little bit more, but I see data as becoming almost a piece of our infrastructure. And one example I'll propose is something like an autonomous vehicles or autonomous tractor. I think I'm using the example here, where if we move towards autonomous vehicles, certainly we need to put and install a lot of physical infrastructure, but we also will need to ensure that there's a free flow of data going back and forth between the environment and the vehicle, between the vehicle and another vehicle. And in many ways, you could make an argument that a lot of this data and a lot of this open data is becoming an important part of our infrastructure. And I was very glad to see in the OECD presentation them talking about intellectual property products being part of the conceptual framework of infrastructure. And I think, this is certainly something that needs to be pursued and thought about in great detail as we see more and more of this occurring. So I'm going to quickly move on to say, okay, this is all great. These measurements are wonderful, but where possibly could we get the data to put these estimates together? Well, I think it's possible, and I'll walk you through a few examples. Now, the first one is, we could stand up some traditional surveys, and I think many of the examples that Jorrit had showed where countries have produced data were using some surveys that they may have developed in the past and reorientating the data, decomposing the data, if you would, into some detail. And I certainly know in the case when I was working at Statistics Canada, we had a capital expenditures survey, which with a lot of asset detail. And we also at that time ran a core public infrastructure survey where we were surveying local governments across Canada, asking for them to essentially tell us at that time, tell Statistics Canada about the state of the environment, or sorry, of the infrastructure and the condition of the infrastructure. And those were very useful tools. They were somewhat expensive, and they take a little bit of a time to develop and to get the data out. So the data is maybe not as timely as what some of the users wanted. I think the area where we might be most interested in looking into is the area of things like satellite images, call it ground truthing of infrastructure. I would argue that most of the infrastructure that we're talking about is visible from space. Most of the infrastructure that we're talking about can be at least quantified with a fairly, in terms of the types of the resolution of the images that you would need, I think are in most cases readily available. So I've always thought, wouldn't it be amazing if a country thinks about or conceives of kind of a register of infrastructure or a census of infrastructure where, from the many images that we have, we geocode all of the infrastructure in a country, whether that be the roads, the schools, the hospitals, and I would argue that most of this is already in digital format, and most of this is in many cases available. So I would, if I was going to focus on where's the source data for things like infrastructure statistics, I would definitely turn and focus a lot on some of this new geospatial information. And then I think that can be complemented by information from the many, many sensors, if you would, that we have, appearing in many different areas. And the example I'm using here simply it's an example taken from the Washington Transit Authority, which measures traffic, if you would, or people passing through turnstile gates as they move into the metro. So you can think of we can quantify the metro or the transit system in a country, and many transit authorities have data that they openly share about ridership, and therefore we can kind of get the use. So we can geolocate the infrastructure, and then we can use some of these open data to look at the use. And this is very interesting. You can kind of really see how the use has dropped off during COVID. That's quite obvious, but you can see, as especially in the US, where COVID restrictions have essentially don't exist in 2022, you can kind of see that the uptake in ridership is not necessarily there, and therefore some conclusion is there's a lot of people now that are still working from home, working remotely. So I would say that that's another area where if you're saying, well, how can we get at the use? How can we get at the condition? How can we get at the access to infrastructure? Well, I think we can use a lot of this imagery information to identify the infrastructure and where the infrastructure is. We can also use things like a national census to identify where the people are in relation to that infrastructure, and combine these data together to really provide important insights for policymakers. So I think a lot of the data that we need exists to put these infrastructure accounts together. Certainly the skill sets we need to do this work in terms of data science, machine learning, and those types of things are important. But I do know that at INEGI, you're one of the top institutions in the world in this area. And I think this is very promising on your side. And then the last thing I would say, just in terms of presenting the information, there's different ways of doing it. I do like tying this information back into the national accounts, because it provides this really nice context in terms of what's being produced, what is the share of infrastructure investment relative to total investment, what's the stock of infrastructure relative to the total stock. And I would also say, and as my last point in terms of presenting this information, because all of this is geolocated, we can be very geographically granular with this information, and therefore it lends itself very well to things like maps and other visualizations to help people really interpret the information that's being presented to them. So with that, I'll just conclude my presentation. Looking forward to any comments and questions, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for this very big overview. And of course, one of the most important things here is how the sources comes. This is one thing. The other is, and you talk a lot about some specific topics in relation with the use of the infrastructure information, the conditions, of course, the access, and this is another point that is very important to look around the infrastructure for different topics. And you took again for some specific themes, and you highlight the digitalization, and this is another thing that we know is very challenge task to get information, especially when we are looking for some. If I have a relationship between the intellectual property products, the platforms means another thing when we are looking services coming from abroad. So this is another point. With this, I have some provocative questions in relation with the link between the national accounts system and, of course, with these new efforts. Jorrit talk about the view around the proposed definition. But this definition is not exactly that we look in the national accounts when we are talking about assets or fixed or the fixed capital, or for example, sorry, the consumption of fixed capital, that is part of the views that we have to look inside of the infrastructure. So with this in mind, what do you think about to transform some specific concepts to go inside of this idea of definition? This is one thing. The other is in relation not only with the definition. In relation, Jim, you talk about some satellite views. Perhaps you use the satellite images. I would like to know your idea about the satellite accounts, about the infrastructure, or thematic accounts. But inside of the framework of the national accounts, and the other provocative is in relation with some specific, not only sources. I believe that the most countries have some specific information according with different frameworks, but again, the technical methods to get this infrastructure for, and let's say that one of the most important methods that almost all the countries use is the PIM. And of course, that gives us another view and not necessarily the granular data. What could you look around these first provocative comments and views? And I will try to listen first. Jorrit, what is your views, and which are next the other part from the view of the IMF, Jim? So, Jorrit, please.
Thank you very much, Francisco. These are indeed good and provocative questions, and I think indeed it's very easy to present the definition and classifications as long as you don't have to do the actual compilation work. But then to translate this into, okay, what does this mean in practice? There are indeed quite a few challenges that you need to overcome, and I think you rightfully point out that whereas in the national accounts we might be looking at specific types of assets. If you look at infrastructure, it's more a functional classification, so you need to decide which assets are going to be taken into account. And maybe part of the assets of a specific sector or a specific industry might qualify for inclusion in infrastructure and some might not. So what we see is that some countries take a more flexible approach to say, well, we just take on board all the assets under this specific asset class for this industry or for this COFOG class, for example, when looking at the government statistics. And we realize that there might be a couple of assets that should not be included, but probably 95% is correct. If you want to be exactly right, you have to go very granular and in that sense have a very detailed breakdown of the relevant assets that are relevant in that sense. And in that sense, it also links to your question related to the PIM method. So indeed, you can apply the perpetual inventory method, so adding up gross fixed capital formation over time. So what has been invested in specific infrastructure assets, how are they revalued over time, how do they depreciate? And to me, this is a very challenging area, but if countries want to arrive at very high quality results for the aggregate asset classes, they need to go very granular in any case, because the composition is very heterogeneous. So if you have several different types of assets inside the class, they might have different depreciation patterns, they might have different service lives, they might have different revaluations, etc., etc. So you have to make the investment to go granular, I think, in any case, and this might help you to have granular information on infrastructure and good quality results at the aggregated level. And in that sense, if you want to get my advice on how to do it, I would focus on those infrastructure classes that are most relevant in your country. Try to figure out what are the specific asset types that we need to capture to have 80%, 90%, and try to have good quality estimates for those and apply the PIM for those, and then make some estimates to get to totals. So you don't have to have each individual asset for each individual entity in Mexico, but you have to get the largest ones, and then to try to get to good quality results for those, add them up to the relevant infrastructure classes for your country. I think that would be the best way to go. And it's not easy, but yeah, hopefully it's feasible. Thanks.
Okay, well, you said something very important. You could see the supply side. And let me add something more, Jim, in relation, because you took the specific point in relation with the supply side of the infrastructure. In the case of Mexico, of course, we have a lot of information that we could use and we could look in relation with from the supply side. But on the other hand is the demand side. And you, Jim, put on the table the idea or point out the idea about the needs for surveys from the demand side to look the infrastructure to have a very good balance. Well, with my first points of view and this one, Jim, please give us some highlights about your feelings on these things. Thank you. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's certainly cheaper and easier to view things from the supply side, and I would you know, first of all, if I was going to design an infrastructure program, I would, as much as possible, actually try and stay away from surveys. In some respects, I think there is probably enough information available digitally through different means to construct a lot of what we want to know about infrastructure. And I would look at it in this way. I would say things like satellite imagery would be a great vehicle in getting kind of the supply of infrastructure in a country, and saying, okay, you know, where is this you know, bridge located? Where is this park located? Where is this recreation facility located? Where is this concert hall located? I think technology exists to allow us to come up almost with a register of infrastructure. Now, we still need to put a value on that, and we still need to understand the dollar value of that. And I think that's where the national accounts aspect comes in. But then on the demand side, or on the use side, I just think it's too expensive to go out and ask households, okay, how are you using this infrastructure? How often do you go to the hockey rink? How often do you go to the concert hall? And I think it's getting too expensive. And I think households don't really want to give out information. But we have a lot of, and I called it sensor data, but you can call it other types of things where we have a lot of indicators on how much individuals are using infrastructure. We have information on number of trips to museums. We have information on riderships of public transit. We have all kinds of sensors on quality of bridges and roads. I drove from Ottawa to Washington last week. I use Waze every time I drive. And I get notifications, oh, there's something on the road ahead of us, or there's there's a police, and well, you could say, well, could an application like that be used to talk about the quality, what was the quality of this patch of road? Is it very good, not so good, and so I think we should start thinking about ways to utilize this information moving forward to get at this kind of this use, condition, access aspect of infrastructure. Of course, this really requires partnerships between statisticians and private and public sectors to make this data available and open in many sense so that we can combine it together and integrate it together into these type of statistics. So, I mean, that's my maybe my wishful thinking of where we go, but I think the opportunity exists, and we really need to just figure out a way to make these types of things happen.
Thank you, Jim. Well, you took another very important point: the communication and the stakeholders, and I mean stakeholders to get the information. Mm-hmm. Well, I know that you has many years working on the national accounts in Canada. What could be the way to, let's say, to get these stakeholders to produce the information in relation with the infrastructure? And this is before the idea about another things in relation with some specific topics that I will touch before. In the case of Mexico, just to give some points, of course, we have, let's say, another kind of infrastructure, because we have the national system of information, of statistical information and geography. And of course, we have the opportunity to look many things around this, but one thing is the classification. And we need from other institutions administrative registers, and of course we have to transform these administrative registers to a statistical purpose, because some administrative registers are part of some specific issues that has the government, for example. So in this case, the communication, what means in relation with your experience in Canada or in the view of the International Monetary Fund? You're mute.
Yeah, I muted myself. Maybe I'll speak a little bit more from my perspective when I was in Canada, because I think that might be most similar to the situation in Mexico. And I think one of the factors where I think this could be very successful is that the institutions that are asking you as a statistical agency, as a statistical information, as a statistical organization for information, are also the ones who actually have the information. And it's the local governments, the state level governments, even the federal governments that are basically saying, hey, INEGI, we want you to tell us about the state of the infrastructure, about the value of the infrastructure, about that. Well, they actually have a lot of the data that you need for an infrastructure statistics program. So I think it's dialogue saying, yeah, we can help you there, but you know, you need to be forthcoming with this information that you're more and more collecting through the course of your business, and we'll take it, harmonize it together in many ways, and allow for a cross-country comparability of information and disseminate that back to you and all other users. So, you know, it's a little bit of kind of this win-win situation that you want to create between the compiler and the holder of the source data to say, look, we got to work this together, and we can use our expertise in bringing this information together, putting it into these standard concepts, classifications, and norms. But you know, you need to provide us some of the underlying tools and data to do that work.
Yes, and Jorrit is the same. The communication, and you probably have the feeling in relation with the OECD countries, especially with the European. What is the way that has in relation with this kind of stakeholders and communication? But in this case, I would like to look not only the producers of this information, of this infrastructure information. I would like to know what happened with the user side or the users.
Yes.
Please,
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, on the user side, we see a lot of requests for more detailed information. So what we see in a lot of OECD countries, that now the question pops up, indeed, could the national accounts provide us with data, some valuation data, but also some of the elements that Jim referred to in his presentation. So people are looking at more detailed insight in who is actually having access to what is the value of all of this, is it sustainable, are governments making sufficient investments to maintain the roads and the bridges, etc. Also in relation now to climate change, does climate change mean that the service lives of some specific types of infrastructure are becoming shorter? Specific issue for the Netherlands, what happens if sea levels are rising? Do we need to have more investment for the dikes and for so a lot of questions, and what we also see is that it's coming from different policy users. So in some cases it's more the financial side, in sometimes it's more ministries for culture and recreation. Sometimes it's more indeed how are we doing in terms of healthcare. For example, now in relation to the COVID crisis, several countries realized that maybe their infrastructure to deal with such a pandemic is not up to speed. So what has been invested over the past decades, has this been decreasing, increasing? What do we need to do? What is the breakdown of health facilities in terms of hospitals, but also in terms of specific ER rooms, etc. So a lot of detailed requests. And I think this also helps in getting more support for work at the statistical offices, because I'm currently also discussing with colleagues within the OECD that are more working on the policy side, and they have decided, okay, we would like the national accounts to start collecting this information, and I'm explaining to them that is very useful, but we probably need to find the resources. So we first need to get the user side lined up so that they indeed realize this is very important information. And if we want good quality data, we need to make a certain investment to facilitate the compilation of all of this information. And as Jim already mentioned, it makes it easier to get a lot of the information, because if the user is the same person as the compiler, as the data provider, it makes it easier to ensure that they provide you with the data, and it's also creating more momentum for other data providers in a country to start providing this information. And just to add what Jim already mentioned, indeed, on the supply side, but also on the user side, what I noticed in the Netherlands, so when I was working at Statistics Netherlands, that we also started to reach out to a lot of private companies that might have relevant information, and they were also interested mainly to know, okay, but how are you going to use this information? Who is asking for this information? To also get a better sense of how they might be using this information, and to tweak it in ways that provide them with relevant insights. And the collaboration benefited on their side to see what statistical office might be doing with the information, looking at the opportunities, and also for them to get the collaboration with an official institute in a country is quite important for them, so that they can say to their users, we also have a collaboration with INEGI or with Stats Canada or with Statistics Netherlands, which provides reliability and is an important qualification for these types of companies. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorrit. And both took something about the Netherlands, and something that I would like to point out is the idea about the value added in relation with the infrastructure. And that becomes another view. Probably is in relation with some idea of the well-being, especially for the households, or especially for the government. I don't know exactly. And I would like to know your feeling around this experience, because it's very important when we are talking about the beyond, for example, beyond GDP. This is another point that I would like to look. And let me give you, in this case, in some cases, well, we was trying to look what happened with the value added of this infrastructure in relation with some specific topics. And let's say, let me say that, for instance, do you feel that the ecosystem services could be a part of this infrastructure? And how do you look this in relation with the idea of GDP, beyond GDP, and to extend the view of the infrastructure? So I would like to begin with Jorrit and then with you, Jim, please.
Thank you very much. These are indeed quite complex questions, and I think it's quite topical, because we are looking into these elements as part of the SNA update. So to look at the link to well-being, I think indeed looking at value added of infrastructure, it shows indeed the importance of this specific industry and creation of infrastructure for the current economy. So how many people are involved in the creation of new infrastructure and maintaining, etc. So I think that is already quite relevant for policymakers to have a better sense of how it is affecting current aspects, current well-being in that sense, because it's involving people's lives. I think a lot of the relevance is also in the stocks, to see indeed how sustainable is the infrastructure for future economic growth, but also future well-being. Do we have enough hospitals in relation to aging society? Are we maintaining the level of schools? Where might more investment be needed, etc. And I think there, if you look at the current system of national accounts, it's mainly looking at buildings, other types of dwellings, and some types of natural assets. And I think it's becoming more and more relevant indeed to look at natural assets, natural resources that are relevant for future well-being. And this is also linked to forests that might be providing you with ecosystem services to provide clean air and recreational purposes and et cetera, et cetera. It's providing relevant inputs for the economy and for well-being. So also focusing on those, and it really depends on the statistical situation of countries if they are already able to do so. But I think this is definitely where the whole statistical system is moving, and we are definitely encouraging countries to start looking into this. And I think a lot of the work on the SIA, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, is already providing a lot of guidance and a lot of recommendations on how to do it. And also indeed on the ecosystem services, there are quite a few recommendations, and in setting up your plans for the next 5 to 10 years, you definitely have to take that into account, also in relation indeed to infrastructure. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jorrit. Jim.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Jorrit said. Maybe just to reinforce a few points. I mean, on not so much on the well-being side, but I do know that users, when they talk about infrastructure investment, often do want to know things about the jobs associated with that. And I know when we were doing this in Canada, a lot of that work was done in the context of the government implementing a large infrastructure kind of fiscal policy. And they were keenly interested in, okay, how many jobs are being created through these investments, and what type of jobs, and so forth. So I think there's always a need on complementing, some of these use access things with, okay, the economics behind it, and what's the job creation. So I know that was heavily demanded. So if you're again thinking about designing a program, think about the jobs aspect is important. On the ecosystem assets, I think this is a great point, is that these are critical assets that we need to start measuring as countries. They provide so much benefit, both economically, but then also culturally, socially, just a whole well-being aspect. Whether we call that infrastructure or not, I mean, I think it makes a really good, I can see it either way. But for me, the point is not whether it's infrastructure or not. The point would be, let's start measuring this, and let's start putting it on balance sheet almost, and quantifying this, and monitoring the extent of these ecosystems, and more importantly, the condition of these ecosystems, because it's the condition that really really matters in terms of future well-being. And maybe that's where I'll take the last point, is on the update of the standards, one of the real focuses we hope moving forward will be more on these net measures. And these net measures, I mean, infrastructure for the most part are assets that do depreciate, and if we don't reinvest in them, we're in many ways losing some of the potential economic and social benefits moving through time. And I think it will be really important to monitor from a kind of a high level macro viewpoint, what's the consumption of these assets moving forward. Now, I saw in the chat a really good question about how accurately can we do that, and that's a really good question. And I would say that's one of the hardest statistics that we have as national accountants, because there's so many variables that go into calculating the net measures in terms of understanding the actual service life of the asset, understanding the sort of the economic depreciation profile, and probably most importantly, having a really up-to-date value of what that asset is, and what the price, if you would, of that asset is. So I some way I agree with the comment in the chat about you know, how accurate can we do this, but the question is a little bit more, I think we have to do it, and we need to improve our methods a little bit. We need to improve our information about service lives and discard functions of assets and things. And OECD has done some really good work in this area as well over the last number of years to really encourage the international statistical community in this area. But that was a good comment. I didn't know if I was going to address it because I thought, oh, I'm going to have to fess up a little bit and say, yeah, that's a real challenge. But really appreciate the question. Thanks.
Okay, well, let me go to some specific questions that I saw in the chat. Almost was answered some from you, Jorrit, so I can not take that, but but on the other hand, to you, Jim, Reyes, María del Carmen Reyes Guerrero asked and said that your presentation was a very innovative proposal by making explicit the geographic nature of infrastructure. Mexico has an opportunity to go beyond surveys. We do have the resources to take advantage of geocoding. Is perhaps a comment and question at the same time. So please, Jim.
Well, I mean, I just will agree with that. I mean, I think INEGI is one of the, you know, forefront in the world in terms of your geospatial work that you do and the access to the information you have. So I think it would be, you know, very strategic for you as an organization to take advantage of all that expertise you have and all that data you have to see how you can leverage it in the context of an infrastructure statistics program. So I think you're, you know, that doesn't mean it's not going to cost anything. These things are always large undertakings, but I think as an institution, you're very well positioned to go down this road.
Yeah. Well, another question from Juan Carlos Moreno, and I don't know if you want to take the microphone, Juan Carlos. If not, I could.
I think they already answered it. I mean, William was really candid and actually very accurate in his response about the inaccuracies of measuring depreciation. Thank you very much, Paco. Thank you, William, and congratulations to both of you.
Okay, and we have from Ismael Aguilar. Of course, he said congratulations to both presenters. And excellent presentations, and probably he wants to know, or he asked or said, could you enhance your comments about the important, I'm not sure if important of effective communication, especially in times of crisis. This is probably
Importance,
excuse me?
It must be importance in business.
Importance of effective communication, especially in times of crisis. And I believe that is in relation with when we have some specific crisis, which could be the better or the importance of effective and efficiency communication. And this is probably for both, but the idea is in relation, what could you see, Jorrit, in this question around the European countries? And what do you see, James, or the views that has the International Monetary Fund? Please, please, Jim, I begin now with you.
Okay. Yeah. I think so. I think, you know, at a high level, oftentimes as statisticians, we put out numbers and we maybe, don't always go the extra step in terms of effectively communicating that. But I think specifically with infrastructure, individuals and often don't relate well to aggregate large national numbers, because it doesn't tell them so much about, well, I'm living in this city or I'm living in this neighborhood, and really I am interested in sort of my surroundings and sort of one aggregate number that, hey, the infrastructure in Mexico is good. Okay, but what about my neighborhood? What about where I live? What about my personal circumstances? And I would say that infrastructure statistics need to be very geographically detailed set of information, and therefore the communication needs to be at the local level in order for it to be impactful for the user, because like I said, they want to know about their neighborhood, not necessarily about the national average. And so it's kind of two things. We have to gear our statistics to be very, very local level, and we have to gear our communication to be very, very local level. And then in times of crisis, I think we also have to be very open to standing up novel indicators for periods of time. And I think the mobility indicators that were stood up during COVID is a great example of the type of ease with which we say, okay, we don't need to spend 3 years developing a methodology. We just need to, we need to tell people kind of what's going on now for the next 6 months, and we need to put some information out and maybe relax some of our methodologies a little bit to get that information out. So maybe that's, I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but I would really stress that infrastructure is a local phenomenon, and communication as much as possible is most effective when it's done at a local level.
Thank you, Jim. Please, Jorrit.
Thanks. Yeah, I think just to add, because I fully agree indeed with Jim. I think in times of crisis, I think what we saw during the COVID pandemic, it only re-emphasized the importance of communication, and then you have the communication with the users to explain to them we are still capable of publishing the results and transparent on how we are compiling the results and how to interpret some of the data, because in times of crisis sometimes it might be a bit difficult to fully understand how to interpret something like non-market output, the output of education if people are being taught at home, etc., etc. And I think also indeed the communication with the data providers in that sense to stress the importance that they continue providing information and how this is important for the final results. And I think what we also saw, the importance of communication across countries, across statistical compilers. How do you deal with common problems? How do you deal with the seasonal adjustment in times of a crisis like this? How do you deal with specific government schemes that have been implemented during the crisis? Specific issues that might be faced by a lot of offices, statistical offices. And I think this also relates to the question indeed on how reliable are our estimates on depreciation in relation to capital stock. And as Jim mentioned, we have been doing quite a lot of work over the past decade, mainly to invite countries to explain what depreciation rates do you apply, what is the service life, which breakdowns do you apply, do you distinguish purchase software from own account software, and do they have different service lives, etc., etc., just to provide better advice to countries on how to compile these results and to arrive at comparable results across countries. So communication on all these levels is key in normal times, and particularly in crisis. What we saw, it's even more important indeed. So yeah, communication is key. Thanks.
Okay. Well, Jim and Jorrit, almost finished this, but I have some specific comments, and one of these probably are important, and I have to say that Fausto Hernandez has a comment in relation, and let me read. He said, "Congratulations, great presentations." A comment: a major benefit of registering infrastructure statistics as detailed as possible is that the design of public policy may be improved. Anyway, thanks for your insights. What do you think? And let me finish with other comments, because Juan Carlos thanks, and he's now we have now here, and on the other is Medina Parra Francisco. He said, great and educational presentations and thoughts. Thank you. But the comment in relation with the design of public policy may be improved probably is a comment of question. Do you want to say something in relation with this? Please, Jorrit, I saw your impassion. Idea to take
No. Yeah, thanks. I think this stresses the importance indeed to compile results at the most granular level of detail as possible, because it leads to the best possible estimates. So they might have different depreciation rates, service lives, etc., etc. And I think if you would feel confident to publish those results at that level of detail, the policymakers have the most detailed available information, and for policy making, they're always looking at the most granular as possible, and for them to tune specific policies to specific areas, to specific topics, to specific types of assets. They need the very granular information. So to me, indeed, it's the question for INEGI, for statistical offices, what is feasible, and are you confident enough on the results to publish? But if possible, always go for the most granular in that sense. Yeah, so I fully agree with the comment, and I can imagine from the policy side, they will ask you to to go as granular as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorrit. Do you have some specific point to set, Jim, in relation with?
Just to agree with your, I think the more detailed that you can get, the better it will be all around. And yeah, very much support moving in that direction.
My friends, always my friends from the OECD and the IMF now. Thank you very much. I will back with Ricardo. I suppose Ricardo Rodriguez is here to have
Yes.
the last quote for this session. Thank you.
No, just to thank you, the three of you, and also Juan Carlos and the rest of the people that are engaged in this panel discussion. Thank you very much for all the insights you gave us. And but for the rest of the audience, please remember, on October 14th, we're going to have another conference. This is from the Office for National Statistics in the UK. Martiani Dun will be presenting their capital stock user guide. So that will be very, very good to know and to get an insight from them of these methodologies, to get an insight of how to properly measure our capital stock. So thank you very much for all you of coming, and see you in the next conference. Yeah, is that all?
Nice to meet you, Jorrit.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Gracias.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Hasta luego. Muchas gracias a todos.